I quite often get asked by people about my textile designing career and how it started. So I'm just making this recording ad lib, just to fill you in on the background. When I was at school, I wasn't much good at lessons at all. In fact, I hardly knew what was going on most of the time. But I did love painting, so I got on really well with painting. And through my childhood, I went through several different ideas for careers. And when I was about 5 years old, my mother asked me what I wanted to be when I grew up. And I very determinedly said, I'm going to be a famous artist like Mr. Cuneo. And Terence Cuneo was a painter of trains who lived in the same road as us. And then after that I went through various other things I wanted to be. So I wanted to be a farmer for quite a while, because most of my relatives were farmers. And then I wanted to be a soldier for quite a while. Up till about the age of 14 I was planning to go to Sandhurst and do officer training. And then I think after that I wanted to be an antique dealer, because I started buying Oriental antiques with my brother. And eventually my art talents emerged. When I was about 15, really, I found I really I'd do these great big paintings based partly on Tibetan tanka paintings, partly on Hiroshige's prints, and partly on the psychedelic art which was in vogue at the time in the late 1960s. So then, by the end of my school days, all I was doing, apart from English, which I also liked, was painting. So it was obvious that I needed to do a career in art. So I applied to 2 art colleges to do my foundation year. First to Epsom in Surrey, and which I got accepted into. And then I had an interview at Kingston Art College, which I also got accepted. So I decided to go to Kingston because it had a better reputation, and it was nearer my home in East Molesey. And I still didn't really know how I was going to earn my living at art. All I knew is I liked painting. And my mother suggested that I should do graphic design, as she thought I'd be really good at doing great big posters. So when I went on the foundation, I told them I thought I wanted to do graphics. But when I did the graphics project, which was just designing a motorway poster, I didn't do very well at all. And the tutor at Kingston, who was in charge of graphics, was also a textile designer, and his name was Anthony Hemmingsley. And he said to me, when looking at my copies of Tibetan tanka paintings, he said, I think we've got a rare phenomena here, a man who would be good at textiles. And I think I gulped, because I had no interest at all in fabric or textiles. Bearing in mind that it wasn't that long ago I wanted to be an army officer. So I went and did the textiles project on the foundation course with the fashion students, and I seemed to do quite well at it. So then for my degree course, after the 1-year foundation, I applied to Hornsey College of Art, or Middlesex Polytechnic as it was known then, and to do the textiles and fashion course. And I got accepted on that, and so then I specialised in printed textiles, because fine art printing had been a passion of mine ever since I discovered Hiroshige's woodblock prints and the amazing... I just loved these areas of flat colour which are actually printed, and then they had gradation within the flat colour and texture within the colour. So Hiroshige's prints totally riveted me. and I loved the idea of doing something for a profession, which in a way was like what Hiroshige was doing, so producing collections of printed art, which I could earn my living at. And on the textile course, which was 3 years long, I actually did very little textile design. Most of the time I just used to go off into the countryside painting landscapes. I used to go and stay with friends in the Malvern Hills a lot, even during the term time, and would just paint and paint outside in the country, whether it was summer or winter. When it was winter, I often used to find a secluded wood or a edge of a field and light a fire to keep warm on a frosty day, and then set up my easel and paint the landscape of the Malverns, or the great vista looking out towards Wales and the Black Mountains. And as it came nearer the time for my degree show, which was in 1976, I thought I ought to start designing a few textiles. So I started painting up some geometric designs. So by the time the degree show happened in the basement at Liberty's in London in June 1976, I had quite a nice little collection of designs. And during the show, an agent called Barry Daniels came along, and he asked me if he could take a collection of my designs to America with him. And he also asked if I would paint up more designs for him. So I was obviously very happy to do that. And I think first of all I worked on a collection of designs for him. So it was 1976. And then I gave the designs over to him for him to take off with him. And then I did some design work with my friend Keith Fassett. He was working on furnishing fabrics for the Company Designers Guild in London, and he needed help putting them into repeat and developing them. So I worked with him for a couple of weeks. And then after that I went off to the Scilly Isles just to paint. And meanwhile my agent came back from his travels and he'd sold a few designs, which just gave me enough money to continue. And then I sort of fell into a pattern like that, where it was, I'd work really hard painting up a big collection for Barry to take off to America, or France or Europe, and then after that I'd go off painting. So I'd do several months designing, then I'd do several months landscape painting. So for several years through the late 70s my career continued like that. And I was making enough to earn my living. But then in the early 1980s, about in 1980, 1981, a recession started developing in the UK, and my sales were getting less, so I was finding it harder to earn my living. So what I did for a while was I did more landscape painting, lots of pastel drawings up along the Thames and out in Hampshire. And I also started trying to make contact with English furnishing fabric companies, because with Barry Daniels I'd mostly just been doing designs for dress fabric and bedding, and that wasn't really my interest. My interest was more in upholstery and wallpaper and furnishings. So I started writing to different companies in England, and I managed to get a little freelance work with Osborne and Little and Sanderson's and GP&J Bakers and Hardy Amis, the fashion designer. and that was just through sending photographs of my work to them. And one day, Anthony Little at Osborne and Little lent me some books of old documentary fabric designs, which are really beautiful, and that inspired a whole new style, because up till then, in the late 70s, I'd been working very much in a sort of English wildflower style. I'd been very inspired by the Country Diary of an Edwardian Lady, which came out around 1978, and I also had a deep love of the English countryside, so I was doing lots of designs of poppies and wildflowers and grasses and butterflies, and sometimes I'd venture into much larger garden flowers. But once I started studying the documents in Anthony Little's book, and then that gave me a whole new direction, because I got inspired by the much more detailed and luscious prints which had been done in the 19th century, both for fabric and wallpaper. So round about that time I started with a new agent, so that's early 1980s, probably about 83. I went over to Nicholas Colwell, or Nick Colwell, who had been one of the other artists who was working with Barry Daniels, and Nick and another lady, Maggie, had set up their own studio, and they had become agents. So I started letting Nick take my designs off to America and Europe with him. And meanwhile I was working hard on developing this new documentary style, and much more gearing my work towards furnishings. And while this was going on, I was still sending off bundles of my photographs of my designs to all the different furnishing fabric companies I could think of. And I started working directly with Harry Hinson in America. That was Hinson and Co. And that was both fabric and wallpaper. And we did something called the Lady Bird Johnson collection, which was a collection of wildflowers inspired by President Johnson's wife's interest in wildflowers. So she gave her name to the collection. And I was also doing freelance work for companies like Warner's, still more for Osborne and Little, more for Sanderson's, and Seckers, who were quite big then, did a lot of prints of my work. And then one day I was on the beach in the Isles of Scilly on one of my painting trips in about 1984, and I was looking through the magazine World of Interiors, and there was an advert by a company I'd never heard of before called Ram, Son and Crocker, and I thought it looked very much in my style. I didn't know Rams had been a really old 19th century English company, and they're originally part of Warner back in the 19th century. It was called Warner Ram, and in about the 1890s they broke up into two companies. So you had Warner's and then Ram, Son and Crocker, because Charles Wager Ram joined up with, I think, the Crocker brothers, who also did printed fabrics in the mid-19th century. And Rams was just re-emerging, having been run down during the 1950s, and it had been bought by two men, Ian Anderson and Keith Lambourne. So Keith Lambourne was the managing director, and Ian was the financial director, and they also had a financial backer. So again, I sent photographs to Ram, Son and Crocker, and Keith, who I later renamed Ginger, seemed to really like my work. So I went over and visited them in just outside High Wycombe at Loudwater, and Ginger bought several of my designs straight off, And then he asked if he could take more designs off to America with him to show to their customers. And that started a working relationship with Ram Crocker. And gradually, all my work started converging on Ram Crocker. The other people, like Hinson, gradually fell away. And soon I was just working full-time for Rams. And eventually Ginger agreed to give me a minimum royalties guarantee, so I could know I'd be able to pay my rent and live off the proceeds of Rams. And then, because we were doing work for more and more companies, we decided to set up a design studio, separate company, which was a design studio called the Lambourne Studio, which, as the directors, would be Ginger, Ian and myself as the art director, because we were doing more and more work for people like Marks and Spencer. And at this time I was also on my own building up a huge archive of antique designs and wallpapers and textiles. And through Ram Crocker, we were providing most of the major American companies with their chintzes. So that included companies like Brunswick, Lee Joffer, Rose Cummings, Baker Furniture, Cravat, Bloomcraft, Marks and Spencer, Kaufman, Travis, J. Yang, Robert Allen, Stroheim and Roman, Drexel Heritage, Schumacher, and many other companies. So this was now late 1980s, going into the early 1990s. And our work was absolutely everywhere. And I used to see it in Hollywood movies, and it was in the White House during the Clinton administration. And it was so much, I was producing so many designs. I was just working absolutely flat out all the time. So we had a colouring studio, but the actual design studio for a long time at Rams was virtually just me on my own, painting away in the cottage I rented on a farm in Hampshire. And again, in about 1991, there was another recession, and a lot of the textile companies were starting to get into trouble because sales were falling off. And at that time in Rams, we were also finding it difficult, but we were then approached by a large American corporation that wanted to buy Rams and wanted to set us up with showrooms all across America. And we agreed to do that. And I then became the design director of Ram Crocker under a 5-year contract with this new corporation. So whilst at that time, that sort of 91, 92, 93, the other companies were hardly producing anything, we were absolutely producing so much work, and we set up these showrooms across America, and one in the D&D Design and Decoration building in New York, and we had parties over in New York to launch for the new showrooms. And also at this time, it was a sort of, I think there are several contributing factors, was I developed an illness known as ME. My doctor brother diagnosed it as ME, and he later also diagnosed it as Lyme's disease because I'd suffered multiple tick bites. So I think it was a combination of those two things, a compromised immune system, and also the fact that I was just absolutely working non-stop. I'd still be designing at sort of 1 a.m, trying to keep up with the demand for our designs across the world. And once I'd got ME, my energy just completely disappeared, and I reached a state where I was having trouble physically sitting upright at my easel. So I used to prop myself up with cushions, so I could almost sort of lean on my easel, so I wouldn't expend energy sitting upright, and then I could still carry on designing at my own pace. And up till then I'd been going across to America quite a bit, mainly to New York, and that then became very difficult. So I remember going to a trade fair in North Carolina, and I could do one day at the trade fair, and the next day I'd be so exhausted I'd just have to stay in bed all day. And then the day after that I'd have got my energy back again, so I could do another day, and then again the next day in bed. So it was becoming very difficult to keep going under those conditions. And also, as the 90s progressed, minimalism was starting to come in. So all through the 80s and early 90s, everyone had wanted these fabulously exuberant floral chintzes, and I was having a time of my life producing them. And then the market was rapidly disappearing, and people were just starting to want no more curtains, they wanted blinds, no more colour, they just wanted beige. So it's what you might call Zen minimalism came in. And IKEA had a logo which was chuck out your chintz. So I think sales were plummeting, and I just carried on producing as many designs as I could with my limited energy. And then one day in 1998, Ginger came down to me and said, "I'm sorry, you've lost your job." And so then suddenly I was sort of, all the designs I'd built up, which were paying royalties over the last 17 years, were suddenly, boom, they were all gone. So I'd lost completely and absolutely lost my income, which is what happens in life. So I sort of picked myself up and dusted myself down. So this was 1998, and I knew I desperately needed to just rest and hardly do anything. So for a while I forgot all about textiles. I would just go off walking in the fields when I could, looking for fossils and doing other projects. And I also started writing books, and so I started working on a book which was later published as Oneself, and another book which was later published as Being. So it's like in your career you get these gaps that come along when all your work disappears, and often that's a sign that you either need to do something else or you need a time to rest and recoup. And so I did a lot of resting, a lot of sleeping, and I mean for several years, because I was so worn out. And then I'd always remembered the lovely story about two frogs who fell in a bowl of milk, and one frog, who was a lazy frog, said we'd lost, and he sank to the bottom and drowned. But there was the other frog who just went on kicking and kicking and kicking until eventually the milk turned into butter and out he hopped. So remembering that, I was still, with the ME, I just didn't have the energy to start at the beginning again, because I'd lost all my work, which I'd done for years. It was all gone with Rams, and the royalties are all gone, and I was just living on my savings. And I didn't have the energy to start lugging my portfolio around London again like I did back in 1981 and 1982. So what I thought I'll just do is I'll be like the frog and just start quietly kicking. So I just started working on designs just for the pleasure of working on them, but not with any thought of immediately selling them. I wanted very slowly to try and build up a collection of designs so it would replace what I'd lost, and I then would have the confidence to start approaching companies. And so that's what I did. I just worked away quietly in my own pace, with no pressure, no deadlines, and really waiting to see what would come next. And round about this time I had a girlfriend who was someone I knew at art college years ago, who I hadn't seen for about 30 years. And at the time she was design director of several different major textile companies. She'd been design director of G.P.&J Bakers, and she became design director of Colfax and Fowler, and then she became design director of Sanderson and Zoffany and Morris and Co. And she saw the work I was doing, and she started inspiring me to get out and start showing it to some of the companies, and also some of the companies she was working for. So very slowly I restarted. It was like I'd had my career was in two parts. I'd had the whole first part, the build up to Ram, Son and Crocker, and then it just suddenly ending, and then a gap in between with very little activity, probably almost for about 7 years, because things often I've noticed go in 7-year cycles. And then with Liz's help I started to sell designs again to Colfax and Fowler and Sanderson and Zoffany. And then I made contract with Andrew Martin, who was very popular in furnishings at the time in England. And Paul Turnbull, the printer, was also helping me. So gradually very slowly, I started rebuilding the furnishing work. And I'd also had to move out of the cottage I was living in Hampshire. And as I had very little income, I went and lived with my brother, who was renting a big farmhouse down in East Dorset, as he had just split up with his partner. So I suddenly found myself living down in a big farmhouse way out in the country, in a little village, just outside a little village in East Dorset, not too far from Verwood. And I was very slowly starting to rebuild my career, doing this work for companies like Sanderson and Morris. And I'd reactivated my archive, so I'd got it all out of the boxes I'd stored it in, and I arranged it in a stable on the farm. And then as I started to make money again, I started to buy in new antique documents. And so I was with this huge archive, so sometimes the people from Sanderson would come down and visit the farm to see the archive, so they could select designs from it for them to develop. And then my brother's a doctor. He has a private practice, which is mostly alternative. And one day, Kay Fassett and his friend Richard were visiting his surgery down in Dorset, and Robert brought them back for tea, because me and Kay were old friends going right back to 1973, but I'd sort of lost contact with him since the 1980s. And Kay and Richard came into my studio. That was 2004. and they saw the stuff I was working on, and Kate said this would be really wonderful for the quilting market, for this company called Westminster Fibres that we set up to do lovely big large prints for quilting, and they were just looking for new artists. So Kate had a look through and selected a few things he liked. So I made him photographs of the designs he liked, and he took them off to America with him to show the people at Westminster, and they got very excited about them. So then I started doing collections for Kate for Westminster Fibres, which was then owned by Coates, because there used to be this. Coates was an old English company which had originally been Coates Viella at one point, and they owned the brand. I think we were Rowan, which was part of Westminster Fibres, which was part of Coates. And my collections soon started selling really well. They were very popular. So more and more my work started converging on Westminster and Caife, in the same way that back in the 1980s I wasn't quite sure which company was the real company, and everything suddenly converged on Ram, Son and Crocker. Now at this point in the early 2000s I thought there must be, my next thing must be out there somewhere, and I had quite a few red herrings where other companies would get really excited and promise me lots and lots, but nothing actually materialised. But with Caife and Westminster, very slowly it started picking up steam as my designs became more and more popular. And through my career I've always had other people who've worked on my colours. So at Rams I had a girl called Liz Keishon, who was a great colourist who I met at Warner's, and I brought her across to Rams, and she used to do my colourways there. And often you have an interaction with the colourist, so you both have your own input going in, and Liz was great. And when Caife asked me to do designs, I said I'd rather you did the colourways, and Caife was thrilled with that because he absolutely adores doing colour. So that just built up and up, and eventually it so took over that Sanderson's and the others just fell away because I no longer had time to do any other work than what I was doing for Westminster Fibres. And it was like I'd found a new market for the really exuberant great big floral designs, which I loved doing, very dense, very full-blown, which had gone out of favour in the mid-90s in the furnishing market. So suddenly here was this whole new market for my archive and my skills and my talents. And because Caife was doing my colours, eventually he brought his partner Brandon Mabley in as well, and we formed what was known as the Caife Facet Collective. So the three of us would work away on the designs, and then Caife would coordinate the collections through his amazing colour schemes. And as a brand, the Caife Facet Collective, or the KFC, became bigger and bigger and more popular. And I was told that we're the best-selling part of the group, of which is now known as Free Spirit. And so that continued to grow, and that completely absorbed me. And then at a certain point, the rental on the Dorset farmhouse ran out, which my brother owned a rental for, and we got very short notice, and I had to vacate it. But my partner, then girlfriend Helen, who was my girlfriend ever since, was living in a housing association house in London, and the upstairs flat had suddenly become vacant, and she was offered the whole house. And that coincided exactly with when I suddenly had nowhere to live and nowhere to put my huge archive, all the thousands of dinosaurs I'd since dug up down on the Dorset beaches, nor my Buddha collection. So suddenly that seemed like the place to live, which was a bit of a culture shock for me, because I'd been used always to living in the country, either next to rivers or in wild valleys or on the edge of hills, and suddenly I was right in the middle of London in Vauxhall, which was a total culture shock, and took a bit of adjusting to, but I did settle in. And around that time, Westminster Fibres, as they were then, who I was doing the K Facet Collective collections for, wanted me to start a new brand, but Kate didn't want it to be under my own name, Philip Jacobs. So I came up with the name Snow Leopard Designs, because I love snow leopards because they're such mysterious, mystical creatures, and they're called the ghost of the mountain, and they inhabit the mysterious mountains of Tibet and China and other places like that, which I really love and have always been attracted to. So at first they asked me to do a botanical collection, which I worked away for about 6 months solid on. And then after that they said, now we want 2 collections every year. So I suddenly found that I was doing 3 major collections a year, because I was doing one for K Facet Collective, which was launched in the spring. Then there was also a second launch of Cave Designs in the autumn, but that was just recolours, so I didn't have to work on that. And then I also have 2 Snow Leopards collections to do, one that comes out in the spring and one in the autumn. So suddenly it had built up so much that I was doing 3 totally new collections each year, which is a huge amount of work. So it was very much like the frog in the milk, that I'd very quietly, after falling in the bowl of milk when I lost my job, I know I needed a long rest, but then I just slowly started to build it up again, to get the work ready, and then to see which companies or company would emerge to be the main company that I worked for. So now I was doing all these collections and just working solidly, having a lovely time, painting the designs as beautifully I could, and they were becoming more and more popular around the world. Very recently, in 2018, that's this year, early in the year, Coates suddenly announced that they were closing Free Spirit down, which was the company which supported both K Facet Collective and Snow Leopard Designs and all the other designers who work in the group, people like Jennifer Paganelli and Amy Butler and Tula Pink. So suddenly our work again appeared to have disappeared. Suddenly all the designs, all the collections were suddenly gone. And then a very short while later, in fact, Liza Lucy, who is part of the K Facet Collective, who works with Kate on the books and on the quilts and on working out the collections and organising them, she said to me, do you trust me to find us someone else? And I said yes. And it turned out that virtually every other quilting fabric company wanted to acquire us. But what happened then is the whole group was acquired by the Jaftex Corporation. So rather than the K Facet Collective going off to to another group on its own, which we had multiple choices to do. The whole of Free Spirit and all the designers were taken over by Jaftex, who's privately owned by a family called the Fortunoffs, with Scott and Greg, the two brothers, and their father. And that's where we are now. So it's been quite a tumultuous time, the handover, but now things are gradually picking up and starting to run really smoothly. And again, I'm continuing to develop my two brands. So I've both got Philip Jacobs for the K-Facet Collective, which I work away on. So I work away on my cave designs for about 6 months. And then when I feel I've got enough for a really strong group, then I'll switch back to Snow Leopard. So then I'll work on a couple of Snow Leopard collections till I've got enough going. And then I'll switch back to the K-Facet Collective again. So that's how it's gone right up to the present day. So that's a 42-year design career. And like life generally, it's never smooth. It's never plain sailing. So with any career, you have to be prepared or with any life, you have to be prepared at a certain point. Your life's just going to fall to bits, and you then have to have a little rest, brush yourself down, and very quietly pick yourself up again and carry on. And that's how life continues. But that's where my career is to date in 2018, and I still have ME, so I'm still very physically compromised. And I have quite firm boundaries up around me, so I won't do anything which I know is going to make me more ill, so I protect myself. And I get up late, so I get enough sleep. And then normally I have a good afternoon and evening to work through. And I love my work so much. I love painting. I love planning collections. I love buying in old antique documentary textiles to develop collections from. And I love all the other things I do within my limited sphere of activity. And I've also now got a summer studio, which is a static caravan down in Dorset, where I solidly spend 7.5 months of the year painting. And then I go and swim in the sea, and I look for dinosaurs on the beach. And I've got my dinosaur collection I've gifted to the nation, which is now over at the Etches collection in Kimmeridge. And then I go off looking for ammonites. And I'm having a thoroughly lovely time. So I know it's up and down, but I'm deeply, deeply grateful for this gift of life and for the talents I've been given to use and develop during it. Because it's sort of like we're all given these talents, and we're also given limitations. And the great art of life is to work with your talents and your limitations. So you find a way of creating a great work of art out of your life, despite the limitations. And we've all got limitations. It might be illness. Some people have mental health. Some people have deafness or blindness or financial traumas, romantic traumas. There are so many different things which can go wrong to make life difficult. And yet, particularly with art, you find a way of dancing through it on top of all these changes. And that's where we are. So I think that's about it. I don't think I've forgotten anything major. So thank you very much for listening. Thank you.